In the heart of a bustling city stood a mansion that towered above all the surrounding buildings. Its walls were a creamy white, the windows so polished that they reflected the sun like mirrors, and the gardens were perfect, with flowers in every color you could imagine. It was the home of a man who had everything money could buy, yet he carried himself in a way that made it clear he believed nothing, and no one was truly his equal. He was powerful, commanding, and sharp in a way that made people both fear and admire him. Every day the mansion hummed with quiet activity. Housekeepers moved with precise steps, keeping the floors immaculate. Chefs prepared meals that were both lavish and delicate, while the staff worked in silent coordination. Among them was a young woman, soft-spoken and quiet, whose days were filled with cleaning, organizing, and making sure every detail of the house reflected the perfection expected by its owner. She had been working there for a few years, and though she was excellent at her job, she rarely received any recognition. The tycoon rarely noticed anyone who did not directly serve his interests, and she had learned to blend into the background. Her mornings began early, before the sun had even fully risen. She would move through the mansion, dusting the grand chandeliers, polishing the silverware, and straightening the heavy curtains that framed the tall windows. Every movement was careful, deliberate, as if she were part of a larger dance that kept the house alive. She worked not for praise, but because she took pride in doing her job well, in making the world she could touch a little more orderly and beautiful. The tycoon, meanwhile, spent his mornings in his private study, surrounded by books, contracts, and expensive gadgets that only added to his aura of power. He would sip his coffee in silence, scanning the newspapers and listening to his assistants report on the latest business deals. He was a man who demanded efficiency and excellence, not just from himself but from everyone around him. Any mistake, no matter how small, would earn a sharp word or a disapproving glance. This made the staff cautious and careful, always walking on tiptoe around his moods. Despite the strict rules and expectations, the cleaner moved through her day with a quiet strength. She had learned to anticipate the tycoon's moods, to know when to speak and when to remain silent. She had a gentle smile, soft eyes, and a way of making the house feel a little warmer, even if the man who owned it barely noticed. She had her own small joys, listening to the faint music that sometimes floated from the grand piano in the drawing room, feeling the soft breeze that came through the open windows, or admiring the tiny imperfections she could correct with a careful hand. It was on one particular morning that the atmosphere in the mansion seemed heavier than usual. The tycoon had scheduled a small gathering, inviting a few close associates to discuss matters that were both serious and personal. The staff moved faster, cleaning with even more precision, knowing that the slightest flaw would be noticed. The cleaner felt the tension in the air but kept her focus, moving from room to room with her usual quiet efficiency. She paused for a moment in the grand hallway, noticing the piano that had always stood in the corner like a silent observer. It was a beautiful instrument, its polished surface reflecting the light and patterns that danced across the walls. She had never been asked to play it, though she had touched the keys in secret on rare occasions, feeling the music flow through her fingers. There was a part of her that loved the piano deeply, a part that longed to express herself through the notes. But she kept it hidden, knowing that in this house personal passions had no place. The tycoon appeared unexpectedly in the hallway, his sharp eyes scanning the room. He was taller than most men, his presence commanding attention without a word. The cleaner straightened immediately, her hands instinctively folding in front of her. He walked past her slowly, as if testing her reaction, and then paused near the piano. He looked at it with a faint smirk, then turned his gaze to her. "Do you play?" he asked abruptly, his voice cutting through the quiet like a knife. The cleaner's heart skipped a beat. She had expected many things, but a direct question from the tycoon was rare and always carried weight. She shook her head gently, trying to keep her voice steady. "A little, sir," she said. The tycoon's eyes narrowed, a glint of curiosity mixed with something sharper. "A little?" he repeated. "We shall see about that." Before she could respond, he walked toward the drawing room, gesturing for her to follow. She hesitated but knew better than to refuse. As she stepped into the room, she saw that a few of his associates were already seated, waiting. The atmosphere was formal, tense, and she felt a wave of nervousness wash over her. This was not a place for her, not among the polished floors, the heavy curtains, and the eyes of powerful men. The tycoon stood near the piano, his hands clasped behind his back. He turned to her with a challenging look. "Play for us," Let us see if your talent is as promising as you claim. The cleaner swallowed hard, her fingers brushing the smooth keys. She felt a mix of fear and anticipation, knowing that every eye in the room was on her. She took a deep breath and began to play, hesitating at first, then finding a steady rhythm. The music was soft at first, careful and precise, reflecting the nervousness she felt inside. As she continued, she allowed herself to lose some of her fear, letting the notes flow more naturally. She played a piece she had practiced in secret, one that spoke of quiet hope and hidden strength. The room grew still, the only sound the piano filling the space. Even the tycoon seemed momentarily caught off guard, his expression shifting from skepticism to something more difficult to read. The cleaner did not notice the change immediately. She was focused on the music, letting it carry her beyond the walls of the mansion and the expectations that weighed on her. She played with a subtle passion, a delicate power that seemed to draw the attention of everyone in the room. For a moment, the divisions of wealth and status melted away, leaving only the music and the person who created it. When the final note faded, the silence was heavy. The tycoon's associates exchanged quiet glances, unsure of what to say. The tycoon himself stood still, his eyes fixed on her, a faint trace of surprise in his expression. For once, his commanding presence softened, replaced by something closer to admiration. The cleaner felt a flutter of hope, mixed with lingering fear. She had not intended to impress anyone, only to play from her heart. The tycoon finally spoke, his voice quieter than before. That was unexpected. He paused, studying her. Very well. We shall see more of this, shall we? The cleaner nodded, unsure how to respond. She returned to her cleaning, but something inside her had shifted. She had been noticed in a way she had never expected. The music had spoken for her, revealing a side of herself that had been hidden for too long. And though the day continued with its usual tasks and expectations, there was a new energy in the air, a sense that things could change, that perhaps her life in this mansion was not as invisible as she had believed. As the sun began to set, casting golden light through the tall windows, the cleaner stood in the hallway, taking a moment to breathe. She felt a mixture of emotions, fear, hope, anticipation, and a quiet pride. The piano, now silent, seemed to hum softly in response, a silent companion that had witnessed her courage and her talent. And in that moment she realized that even in a place where power and arrogance ruled, there was room for talent, for recognition, and for the unexpected turning of events. The day had begun like any other, but it had ended with a whisper of possibility. And for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to imagine a future where her abilities could not be ignored. The morning after the unexpected piano performance, the mansion seemed quieter than usual. The usual rhythm of the staff moving through the halls felt heavier, almost as if everyone was waiting for something to happen. The cleaner moved through the rooms with her usual diligence, dusting, polishing, and arranging things as if nothing had changed. Yet inside her mind was racing. She kept replaying the moment when the tycoon had asked her to play, and how she had almost been humiliated. It was a mix of fear and relief, but mostly fear. She had always known the tycoon's moods could shift quickly, and she worried that what had begun as a curious request might turn into something far more uncomfortable. As she was straightening the cushions in the drawing room, she heard the heavy footsteps of the tycoon approaching. He entered without knocking, his presence filling the room. The cleaner instinctively lowered her gaze, her hands frozen for a moment over the velvet cushions. He walked slowly toward the piano, his eyes scanning the polished surface, and then turned to her with a look that was impossible to read. "It is time," he said simply. Her heart skipped a beat. She had known this day might come, but hearing it aloud made it real. "Time for what, sir?" she asked softly, keeping her voice calm even as anxiety gripped her. He didn't answer directly. Instead, he gestured toward the piano. "Play. They will arrive soon, and I want to see if your little display yesterday was just luck. Show me your skill." She felt a knot form in her stomach. The idea that she might be forced to play for others to judge her filled her with dread. She nodded quietly, trying to steady her shaking hands. She approached the piano, running her fingers lightly over the smooth keys, feeling the familiar touch that had always brought her comfort. But now the comfort was tinged with fear. This was not private practice. This was a test, a performance where she was the center of attention, and the tycoon's eyes seemed to pierce right through her. The first few notes were hesitant, cautious, as she tried to find her footing. The tycoon watched her closely, his expression unreadable. She could feel the weight of his judgment pressing down on her. Heavier than the polished wood of the piano, the mansion felt colder. The silence of the empty drawing room amplifying her nervousness. She glanced at the door, half expecting the other staff members or the tycoon's associates to appear at any moment. Each note was a careful negotiation between fear and courage. As she played, she began to notice something subtle. The tycoon's posture had shifted. He was no longer frowning or smirking. He was watching with an intensity that made her doubt whether she should continue or stop. Her fingers moved more confidently across the keys, and the music that had been hesitant started to flow more naturally. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking a tightrope, that any misstep could lead to humiliation. The door opened quietly, and a few of the tycoon's associates stepped in. Their eyes were curious, some skeptical, some intrigued. The cleaner's heart pounded as they took their seats, and she felt their gaze like a physical pressure. She forced herself to focus on the music, letting her hands and memory guide her rather than her fear. She remembered the pieces she had practiced in secret, the melodies that had always comforted her when she felt alone or overlooked. She poured that energy into her performance, hoping that the music could speak for her where words would fail. The tycoon leaned slightly forward, his hands clasped behind his back, eyes fixed on her every movement. There was a faint tension in his jaw, a sign that he was surprised by how well she played. The cleaner noticed, but she didn't let it distract her. She focused on the rise and fall of the melody, on the gentle crescendos that made the room feel warmer despite the anxious energy surrounding her. She could feel the subtle shift in the room. The associates were leaning slightly forward, listening intently, their skepticism giving way to appreciation. The cleaner felt a spark of hope, but it was quickly followed by a rush of fear. She reminded herself that she was still vulnerable, still at the mercy of the tycoon's judgment. One wrong note, one moment of hesitation, and the carefully constructed image of talent she was presenting could crumble in an instant. As she played, she began to understand that this was more than just a test of her skill. It was a test of her courage, of her ability to stand firm under pressure, and to let something beautiful emerge even when the stakes were high. Her fingers moved with increasing confidence, her body relaxing into the rhythm of the music. The notes filled the room, winding around the polished surfaces, echoing in the high ceilings, and creating a space where only the music and her presence mattered. The tycoon's expression was changing. The sharpness in his eyes softened, replaced by something closer to curiosity and fascination. He had expected a timid, possibly clumsy performance, one that would amuse him and his guests. Instead, he was witnessing talent that was genuine and unexpected. The cleaner noticed the subtle shift, and it bolstered her resolve. She played with more emotion, allowing the music to tell the story she had always kept hidden, a story of quiet resilience, of dreams kept alive in the shadows, and of the power of beauty to transcend fear. By the time she reached the final notes, the room was silent. The music lingered in the air, wrapping around the listeners, leaving a sense of wonder and disbelief. She let her hands rest on the keys, her chest rising and falling as she tried to catch her breath. She felt exposed, vulnerable, yet stronger than she had ever felt before. The silence was heavy, filled with anticipation as everyone waited to see what the tycoon would do next. He stood for a moment, and then slowly, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. The faintest trace of a smile appeared on his face, though it didn't reach his eyes completely. "You play well," he said finally, his voice low and measured. "Better than I expected." A wave of relief washed over the cleaner, but it was tempered by the knowledge that this acknowledgement did not erase the tension, nor did it guarantee that she was free from his power. She gave a small, respectful nod and began to move away from the piano, her hands still trembling slightly. The tycoon's associates murmured quietly among themselves, impressed by what they had heard. The cleaner could hear snippets of their conversation, words like unexpected and talent floating through the room. It was both gratifying and nerve-wracking. She had never sought recognition, only the simple joy of expressing herself through music. Yet here in this mansion of power and expectation, her music had made an impact, and she could not ignore the strange mixture of fear and pride that filled her. The tycoon turned back to the piano, running a hand over the polished surface. He seemed lost in thought for a moment, then looked at her again. "I did not believe you would have such skill," he admitted, his voice carrying a rare note of honesty. "But now I see. Talent can appear where you least expect it." The cleaner kept her eyes lowered, unsure of how to respond. She did not seek to challenge him, nor did she want to draw unnecessary attention to herself. She simply nodded, acknowledging his words without pride or arrogance. Inside, however, she felt a small flame of confidence growing, a realization that her abilities had value beyond the quiet corners of her daily routine. The morning continued, but the dynamics in the mansion had subtly shifted. The tycoon's interest in her talent seemed to linger, a quiet curiosity that had not been there before. She moved through her duties with renewed focus, her mind replaying the events of the morning, aware that something fundamental had changed. She had faced the possibility of humiliation and emerged with her dignity intact, her skill recognized even if only partially. As she completed her tasks, she could feel the eyes of the staff on her, subtle glances that reflected surprise and perhaps newfound respect. The cleaner did not seek it, nor did she want to boast, but she felt the power of recognition even if it was quiet and tentative. She realized that this was just the beginning, that the mansion held many challenges and uncertainties, but she had found a way to navigate them, to let her talent speak when words might fail. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the city skyline, casting long shadows across the mansion, the cleaner paused by the piano once more. Her fingers hovered over the keys, remembering the morning's performance. The room was silent now, empty of guests and observers, yet she felt a connection to the music that had filled the space. It was a reminder that even in places of power and authority, there was room for beauty, for skill, and for moments of unexpected grace. She took a deep breath, letting the day's tension settle in her chest, and then ran her fingers lightly across the keys, allowing a few gentle notes to escape. They were soft, tentative, and personal, a quiet celebration of resilience and courage. In that moment, she knew that while the tycoon might still hold power over her circumstances, her talent was her own, a part of her that no one could take away. The day had started with fear and the looming threat of humiliation, but it had ended with a revelation. Her music had spoken, and even in a mansion filled with wealth, authority, and expectation, it had carved a space for something genuine and human. She moved away from the piano, her heart lighter yet full of anticipation, knowing that the path ahead would hold new challenges, but also new possibilities. She had faced the tycoon's test and had, in her own quiet way, emerged stronger, more confident, and ready for whatever might come next. Days passed after the cleaner's unexpected performance, but the memory of that moment stayed fresh in everyone's mind. The mansion had never felt quite the same. Whispers moved quietly among the staff, gentle conversations about how the cleaner, the one who usually went unnoticed, had played the piano so beautifully that even the tycoon himself had been left speechless. It was the kind of story that didn't fade quickly, and every person who had witnessed it seemed to carry a small spark of amazement when they spoke about it. The cleaner, however, tried to return to her daily work as if nothing had changed. She polished the same furniture, dusted the same shelves, and moved through the same halls. But something inside her was different. She felt both nervous and proud. It was strange to be seen after so long being invisible. She didn't want special treatment. She only wanted to be respected for what she could do. Still, a part of her worried about what the tycoon might be planning next. His curiosity had grown, and with it, his expectations. Early one morning, as the golden light spilled through the tall windows, she was called to the study. The messenger's tone had been polite but firm, leaving no room for refusal. She wiped her hands on her apron and made her way down the long corridor, her footsteps soft on the polished floor. When she entered the study, she found the tycoon standing near the window, his back to her. The city stretched out beyond the glass, busy, bright, and full of motion, but he seemed distant, lost in thought. Without turning, he said, "I've been thinking about your performance." She froze, unsure of what to say. Silence hung in the air like a weight. Finally, he turned to face her. "You have talent," he said, his tone calm but direct. "Real talent. And yet you spend your days cleaning floors." The cleaner lowered her eyes. "It's my job, sir." He studied her for a moment, as if trying to understand her simplicity. "Do you realize how rare it is for someone to play like that without training?" She didn't answer. She had always known that her gift was something special, but she had never thought it could mean anything beyond personal joy. Her family could never afford lessons, and music had always been her private comfort, not a path to success. The tycoon moved closer to the piano that stood in the corner of his study. "I want to hear you again," he said. "Not for my amusement this time, but because I need to know what I saw wasn't a fluke." She hesitated, unsure if she should refuse or obey. But his tone left no choice. She walked slowly to the piano, her fingers trembling slightly as she sat down. The silence in the room was thick, only broken by the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. She began to play softly, choosing a melody that was gentle but full of emotion. The first few notes floated through the air, delicate and pure. The tycoon didn't move. He simply listened, his gaze fixed on her hands. As the music grew richer, the sound filled the room with warmth. The cleaner forgot about his watchful eyes and the pressure that had followed her since that day. For those few minutes, there was only her and the piano. When the final notes faded, the tycoon spoke again. His voice was quiet but full of something she had never heard from him before. Respect. "You have something that can't be bought," he said. "It's rare." The cleaner looked up, startled. She had never expected to hear such words from him. He seemed lost in thought again, pacing slowly as if trying to understand how this woman, his cleaner, could possess something that so few did. In the days that followed, the tycoon's behavior toward her began to shift. He didn't speak to her harshly anymore, and sometimes he would stop to listen when she passed by a room where the piano sat waiting. One afternoon, he even asked her to play during one of his private gatherings, though this time his tone was less commanding and more curious. The guests arrived, dressed in fine clothes, their laughter echoing through the hall. The cleaner stood near the piano, nervous but composed. She could feel their eyes on her, some amused, some skeptical. To them, she was just part of the staff, someone who didn't belong behind such an elegant instrument. When she began to play, the laughter faded. The melody that filled the room was hauntingly beautiful, filled with emotion that no one expected. Her fingers danced across the keys with grace and confidence, each note drawing the listeners deeper into the story she was telling through music. The atmosphere changed. Even the servants who had stopped to watch from the doorway felt a strange stillness settle over them. The cleaner played not for approval, but because the music inside her needed to be heard. The tycoon sat among his guests, watching her closely. He noticed how the expressions of his friends changed, from amusement to quiet admiration. He saw how the room, once filled with noise and arrogance, had fallen silent under the spell of her playing. For the first time in a long while, he felt something unfamiliar stir within him. It wasn't pride or possession, it was humility. When she finished, there was a brief pause before the applause began. It started hesitantly, then grew stronger, echoing through the high-ceilinged room. The cleaner stood, her cheeks flushed, unsure of what to do. She bowed her head slightly, whispering a quiet thank you before stepping away from the piano. After the guests had left, the tycoon approached her. His tone was different, softer, almost cautious. "You played beautifully," he said. "You've given my guests something they won't forget." The cleaner didn't know what to say. She only nodded, murmuring, "Thank you, sir." He looked at her for a long moment before speaking again. "Tell me," he said, "how did you learn to play like that?" She hesitated, her hands twisting together. "I taught myself," she replied simply. "When I was young, there was an old piano in a community hall near my home. I used to sneak in when no one was there. I listened, practiced, and tried to remember every sound." The tycoon nodded slowly. He seemed to be trying to understand how someone with no formal training could produce such music. "And you never took lessons?" She shook her head. "No, sir. My family couldn't afford it. I just played because it made me happy." There was something genuine in her voice that caught him off guard. He was used to people chasing money, power, and recognition. But this woman, this cleaner, played only because it brought her peace. It was a thought that stayed with him long after she left the room. Over the following weeks, the piano became a more frequent part of the mansion's life. Sometimes the tycoon would ask her to play in the evenings when the day's business was done. Other times she would play alone, filling the halls with melodies that made even the other workers pause to listen. The mansion, once cold and formal, began to feel alive with warmth and sound. For the cleaner, these moments were both a gift and a test. She was grateful for the chance to play, but she never forgot her position. She still cleaned, still moved quietly through her duties. Yet whenever her fingers touched the piano, She felt like she belonged to a different world, a world where her worth wasn't measured by her uniform or her silence, but by the music that lived inside her. The tycoon, too, had changed in subtle ways. He was still demanding, still proud, but something in him had softened. He began to notice the people around him more, their effort, their dedication, the quiet strength it took to serve without recognition. And though he didn't say it aloud, he had begun to respect the cleaner in a way that surprised even him. One evening, as she played a slow, sorrowful tune, he stood by the doorway and listened. The melody carried a quiet sadness that tugged at something deep within him. When she finished, he said softly, "You play as if you've lived 100 lives." She smiled faintly. "Maybe music lets us live more than one, sir." He didn't reply, but her words stayed with him. For a man who had built his life around wealth and control, it was unsettling to realize that something as simple as music could make him feel small, in a good way. The cleaner, without intending to, had begun to teach him something about humanity, about the beauty that exists beyond power and money. As days turned into weeks, rumors about the talented cleaner spread beyond the mansion. Some guests asked about her when they visited. Others wanted her to play again. The tycoon, who once sought to humiliate her, now found himself feeling a strange sense of pride. He didn't fully understand why, but her music had changed the way people looked at his home and at him. The cleaner remained humble, always polite, never forgetting her duties. But inside she carried a quiet glow, a sense of fulfillment she had never known before. Her music had become her voice, and through it she had gained something no one could take away: respect. That night, after everyone had gone to sleep, she sat by the piano once more. The mansion was silent, the moonlight spilling through the windows. She pressed the keys gently, playing a tune that was soft and full of hope. The music floated through the air, whispering of new beginnings and quiet dreams. In that moment, she realized that her life had changed, not in wealth or status, but in something deeper. She had found her place in a world that had never truly seen her before. And as the last note faded into the stillness of the night, even the tycoon, standing quietly in the hallway, felt something stir inside him. A feeling he hadn't known in years, admiration mixed with humility and perhaps the faint beginnings of change. The days following that unforgettable evening were different for everyone in the mansion. The air felt lighter, even though no one dared to speak openly about what happened. The guests who had attended the dinner still whispered about the cleaner, who played like a professional pianist. Some said they had never seen the tycoon so quiet, so humbled. Others thought it was all planned, that the tycoon had hired her secretly to surprise his guests. But the truth was far simpler. No one, not even the tycoon himself, had expected her to be so gifted. The cleaner continued with her usual duties, mopping floors, dusting tables, and polishing the grand piano. But now the piano didn't feel like a stranger anymore. It almost felt like a friend waiting patiently for her hands to return. Sometimes, when the mansion was silent and she was sure no one would hear, she'd play softly, only a few notes, enough to calm her heart. But she didn't realize that the tycoon had begun noticing her differently. He no longer saw her as just a cleaner. Something about her music had shaken a part of him he didn't even know existed. He started to appear in places where she worked, at the garden, in the hall, or near the piano room, always pretending he was just passing by. But his eyes followed her every movement, and he listened quietly whenever she touched the piano keys. One afternoon, he finally spoke to her again. He walked into the music room while she was cleaning near the window. She turned immediately, nervous, her hands tightening around the cloth she held. "You play beautifully," he said in a calm tone. She didn't know what to say. Compliments were rare from him. She nodded slightly and whispered, "Thank you, sir." He stood for a moment as if searching for the right words. "Do you practice often?" She shook her head. "No, sir. I don't have a piano at home." There was a pause. He looked at the grand piano, then at her again. Something changed in his eyes, less pride, more curiosity. "That's a shame," he murmured. "Talent like yours shouldn't be hidden." He left without another word, but those few sentences stayed with her the whole night. Over the next few days, strange things began to happen. A new schedule was posted on the notice board for the staff. The cleaner noticed her name had been moved. She was now assigned to piano room maintenance twice a week. She thought it was a mistake, but the tycoon's assistant confirmed it was his decision. During those hours, she was alone in the piano room, free to clean, and if she wished, to play. The tycoon sometimes sat quietly in the corner pretending to read the newspaper, but really he was listening. Her fingers danced across the keys, each note telling a story he had never heard before. It was the first time in years that someone's presence didn't make him feel superior. It made him feel small, human, and strangely peaceful. Soon his guests began returning to the mansion. They came with polite smiles but were clearly curious. "We heard about your cleaner," one of them said during an evening gathering. "The one who plays like a concert pianist?" "Is it true?" The tycoon gave a small smile. "You'll see for yourself." The cleaner froze when she heard about it. She hadn't agreed to perform again. The memory of standing in front of all those people still made her heart race. But this time, the tycoon's request wasn't cruel. He approached her before the event and said, "You don't have to if you don't want to. But I believe you should." For the first time, his voice wasn't commanding. It sounded almost kind. That night, she played again. Not because she was forced to, but because she wanted to. The audience fell silent, listening as her music filled the grand hall. Every note carried warmth and emotion, echoing through the marble walls. The guests were astonished not just by her skill but by the emotion behind every sound. When she finished, there was a long pause, then applause erupted. The tycoon didn't clap right away. He just stared at her, a faint smile softening his face. He looked proud, but not in the way of a man showing off something he owned. It was different. It was the pride of someone who had finally learned to see value beyond money and status. After that evening, her life began to change. The guests asked about her. Some wanted to know where she had studied music. Others offered to sponsor her if she ever wanted lessons or a piano of her own. The tycoon didn't stop them. In fact, he encouraged it. One morning, she came into the piano room and found something covered with a white cloth. When she pulled it away, her eyes widened. It was a smaller piano, polished and new, with a note resting on top. The note said, "For your practice. You deserve it." She couldn't believe it. Her hands trembled as she touched the keys. That day, when the tycoon entered, she tried to thank him, but he waved his hand gently and said, "No thanks needed. Just keep playing." From that moment, a quiet friendship began to grow between them. He would often sit by the window while she played, sometimes sharing stories from his childhood. Stories of how he had once learned music, but quit because business took over his life. She listened quietly, sensing a kind of sadness in his voice. He confessed one evening, "I used to think success was about power and money, but when you played that night, it reminded me that some things can't be bought." She smiled softly but didn't reply. Her music spoke for her. Days turned into weeks, and their conversations grew longer. The staff noticed the change too. The tycoon wasn't shouting as often. He smiled more, even joked sometimes. The mansion didn't feel so cold anymore. But deep inside, she still carried a quiet fear that this new peace was temporary, that one wrong step could send her back to being invisible again. She knew her place in the world and didn't want to believe too much in miracles. Then, one afternoon, something happened that she would never forget. The tycoon received a call from a local charity foundation. They were organizing a fundraising concert and looking for talented performers to raise donations. He immediately thought of her. At first, she refused. "I can't, sir. I'm not a professional. People will laugh," but he shook his head. "They won't laugh. They'll listen." It took days of convincing, but finally she agreed. The concert night was magical. The hall was full of people, and when she walked onto the stage, she felt the same fear she had once felt in the mansion. But then she saw him in the front row, nodding reassuringly, and suddenly the fear melted away. She began to play. The room filled with music so pure and heartfelt that it moved people to tears. When she finished, the applause was thunderous. The tycoon stood up and clapped, a genuine smile lighting his face. For her, it wasn't just applause, it was freedom. After that performance, people began to know her name. She was invited to play at small events, schools, and even on television once. Each time she looked back at the mansion where it all began. The tycoon, on the other hand, found himself changing in ways he couldn't explain. He donated more, listened more, and treated his staff with kindness. He no longer felt the emptiness that wealth alone had never filled. It was as if her music had healed something broken inside him. One evening, after she returned from another performance, he asked quietly, Do you ever plan to stop working here? She smiled, wiping her hands with a cloth. I don't know, sir. This place gave me everything. Maybe one day. But for now, I'm happy where I am. He nodded, though something in his eyes showed both pride and sadness. He knew she was meant for more than the mansion walls could offer. That night, as she left the piano room, she turned and said softly, "Thank you for believing in me." He didn't reply. He just watched her go, realizing that sometimes the greatest lessons in life come from the people you least expect. The mansion that had once echoed with arrogance now carried music instead. And in that quiet harmony between two very different souls, both had found what they didn't even know they were missing: respect, kindness, and a reason to believe that even in the coldest hearts, warmth can still be found. Months had passed since the night of the charity concert, yet the memory of that performance still lived fresh in everyone's mind. The cleaner had become a small local sensation, though she never let it change who she was. She still arrived early every morning at the mansion, her hands carrying the same cleaning cloth, her heart as humble as the day she started. But there was something different about her now. She moved with quiet confidence, her eyes brighter, her voice calm and sure. She had finally learned that her worth was no ever tied to her uniform or the task she did, but to the person she was inside. The tycoon had changed too. His old arrogance had faded like dust washed away by rain. The mansion felt warmer, more alive. He started treating the staff with kindness. The once cold halls were now filled with gentle laughter and soft music drifting from the piano room. Some of the staff even whispered that he smiled more often now. They said it was the cleaner who had changed him, though she never believed it when she overheard. One morning she arrived to find the tycoon sitting quietly in the piano room. He looked different, thoughtful, maybe even tired. He gestured for her to sit at the piano. "Play something," he said softly. She nodded and began to play a simple melody, one she had written herself. The notes filled the room like sunlight, warm and tender. When she finished, he didn't clap or speak for a long while. Finally, he said, "Do you know I used to believe that people only respected me because of my money? But that night when you played, I realized respect can't be bought. It's something you earn, something you inspire." She looked at him, unsure what to say. The man who once looked down on her was now sitting before her, speaking with honesty. It didn't feel like a master and servant anymore. It felt like two people who had lived through something that changed them both. He continued, "You taught me that talent and dignity can live in any heart, even in the ones I never thought to notice. You reminded me that kindness matters more than control." His words touched her deeply. For a moment she saw the loneliness behind his wealth, the emptiness he had carried for so long. She smiled faintly and said, "Music has a way of teaching things words can't." He nodded, eyes glistening with a mix of gratitude and regret. "You've taught me more than I ever expected to learn." Days turned into weeks, and soon her name began appearing in small newspapers. People wrote about the cleaner who could play like a professional pianist. Some articles even mentioned the tycoon's mansion, calling it the place where her journey began. Invitations began arriving from other cities, from music teachers who wanted to train her, from concert halls that wanted her to perform. She was overwhelmed by it all, unsure if she was ready for such a big step. The tycoon noticed her hesitation one afternoon when she sat silently by the window after finishing a piece. "What's stopping you?" he asked gently. She sighed. "I don't know if I belong in that world. I'm just—" Mammy smiled faintly. "That's exactly why you belong there. Because you don't play for fame. You play because it's who you are. And people feel that." She looked at him, realizing how much he had changed. The same man who once humiliated her was now the one pushing her to rise higher. The thought filled her with emotion. "What if I fail?" she whispered. He stood up slowly, walking toward the piano. "Then fail beautifully," he said with a small smile. "Because even your failures will sound better than most people's success." It was the kindest thing anyone had ever said to her. Eventually, she decided to accept an offer to study music formally. It was a small program at a nearby academy, but for her it felt like a dream come true. The day she told the tycoon, he didn't speak for a while. He just looked at her, the faintest trace of sadness in his eyes. "I knew this day would come," he said. "You were never meant to stay hidden here." She smiled, though her heart felt heavy. The mansion had become her second home, and he had become something like family. "Thank you," she said softly, "for believing in me when I didn't believe in myself." He nodded. No, he said, his voice quiet. Thank you for reminding me what it means to be human. The day she left, the staff gathered to see her off. The tycoon stood by the door, watching as she stepped into the car, waiting for her. Before she left, she turned to him and said, I'll come back one day. I promise. He nodded again but didn't speak. Words seemed too small for that moment. Months passed and the mansion grew quieter without her. The piano still stood in its place, but it remained untouched most days. Sometimes the tycoon would walk into the room and sit by it, his hand resting on the keys, remembering the melodies she used to play. The silence reminded him of her presence more than sound ever could. Meanwhile, her life changed in ways she never imagined. She studied music seriously for the first time, learning techniques and theories she had never known existed. At first she struggled, but she remembered his words, failed beautifully, and kept going. Soon her natural gift began to shine again and people started to take notice. She began performing at small concerts, her story spreading everywhere she went. People were moved not just by her talent, but by her humility. Years later, she returned to the mansion, now an accomplished pianist with her own music album. When she walked through the grand gates again, everything looked familiar yet different. The garden was still blooming, the walls still shining, but the air felt quieter. She found the tycoon sitting in the same chair by the window, a bit older but still with that same calm expression. He looked up as she entered and smiled faintly. I knew you'd come back, she laughed softly. I promised, didn't I? They sat together for hours, catching up on lost time. She told him about her travels, the places she'd seen, the people she'd met. He listened quietly, pride shining in his eyes. When she finished, he asked, Do you still play that same melody? She nodded. Every time I miss home, he chuckled. Then play it now. She sat at the piano once more, her fingers gliding effortlessly across the keys. The music filled the room, carrying with it years of memories, the humiliation, the discovery, the transformation. When she finished, she turned to find him wiping his eyes quietly. You've come a long way, he said softly. So have you, she replied. He smiled and leaned back, closing his eyes as if letting the music linger a little longer. It's funny, he said after a while. I thought I had everything a man could want, but it took someone like you to show me what I was missing. She placed her hand gently on the piano, looking at him with warmth. Sometimes the richest people are the ones who find peace, not wealth. He nodded, a soft laugh escaping his lips. You always did have a way of saying things simply. As the sun began to set, its light spilled through the tall windows, bathing the piano room in golden warmth. They sat together in silence, no words needed. The melody still hung in the air, gentle and eternal. From that day on, she visited often, sometimes just to play for him, sometimes to share stories of her new life. And each time she played, he felt a deep sense of gratitude for the second chance at being human, for the music that had healed him, and for the woman who had once been invisible but had become unforgettable. In the end, their story was not about wealth or fame. It was about change, kindness, and the way one act of cruelty turned into a lifelong bond built on respect. The tycoon never again used his power to belittle anyone, and the cleaner, now a celebrated pianist, never forgot where she came from, or the man who once forced her to play the piano, only to discover the music that changed them both forever. And so, in that mansion where pride had once ruled, the sound of a piano still echoed, a melody that told the world a simple truth. Sometimes, the most unexpected people can teach us the most beautiful lessons.